Welcome to the Real View podcast, where Ohio Realtors connect you to innovators and influencers, keeping you with the real view of real estate. Whether you're a broker, agent, first-time homebuyer, industry leader, or just happen to stumble upon our podcast today, you can expect to hear tips, tools, tricks, interesting information, and so much more from the experts in Ohio's real estate game.
Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of The Real View. I'm Anastasia Katkowska, Manager of Advocacy and Research at Ohio Realtors, and I'm joined today by Andrew Huffman, our Assistant Vice President of Government Affairs. Andrew, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Anastasia. Happy to be here.
Today, we will be diving into everything Ohio Realtors has been working on at the State House during lame duck the past few weeks, and we will also be taking a broader look at the key legislative efforts from this General Assembly. I know we have a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. Let's start with lame duck. For those of you who don't know, lame duck is the period after an election and during the last few weeks of a General Assembly, which happens every 2 years. It's a time when outgoing legislators and the current General Assembly push to wrap up unfinished business before the year ends and the new General Assembly begins. Andrew, this is always a busy time for Ohio Realtors. Can you tell us what happened during this lame duck session and what were some of our top legislative priorities the past few weeks?
Yeah, Anastasia, you hit the nail on the head. Lame duck is always a very hectic time at the State House as lawmakers try to pass as much legislation as they can by the end of the year. And this year was no different. It was extremely busy. We had heard rumors that it was going to be relatively quiet, but that was wrong. It was extremely busy. We saw dozens and dozens of bills passed that last week of session, which was the last session day was on December 18th, and that started Wednesday morning and didn't wrap up until the wee hours of Thursday morning. So we put in some hours this past week, and the lame duck session was really highlighted in addition to the dozen or so bills that they passed. They amended a bill, and it was the last bill that they reported by the end of the year, with a massive 441-page amendment that included hundreds of changes. And so we had to stay on the ball the whole way through, and I'm happy to report that it turned out pretty well for us in lame duck. We were able to work on a number of priorities that really gained some momentum, one of which is an issue that we've been advocating for years. It's the Ohio Homebuyer Plus program. We were successful in creating this program last year, and what it does, Anastasia, it allows Ohioans to open up a savings account and make contributions to that savings account that are put towards the purchase of a new home. And those contributions can be deducted from an individual's income taxes. So we provide a program that provides tax savings to Ohioans saving for the purchase of a home. In addition to the tax savings, you also, these accounts earn above market interest rates. So it's really a win all around. You get the tax savings plus a higher interest rate. And the only caveat is that the funds have to be used towards the purchase of a new home in Ohio. The program's been extremely well received. We've seen almost 20,000 accounts opened in the first year, but lawmakers and the treasurer's office who we've been working with on this program said, you know what's strange? The military personnel are not eligible, who are stationed in Ohio, are not eligible for this program because they're not classified as Ohio residents. They may have their residency in a different state, but they're stationed here. And we worked together to pass legislation, Senate Bill 257, to expand eligibility to those military personnel serving in Ohio. And so that was really well received, and I'm happy we were able to get that passed by the end of the year. And then that massive amendment on the final bill of the session that I was talking about, we were able to make a couple of changes in there as well. Anastasia, the first one is a housing technical assistance fund. This is a $1.5 million fund that local governments are eligible for if they update their zoning regulations. And we understand in talking to a lot of our friends at the local level that there is a desire to update zoning regulations and make it easier for housing developments, but many smaller communities just don't have the resources to go about doing that. And so we hope this fund, this $1.5 million, will help move the needle when it comes to zoning reform. So very happy to get that done by the end of the year.
It's great. And this is something that we testified on too, right?
We did. We did. It was in a standalone bill, House Bill 315, which actually ended up being the massive omnibus bill that passed. The Senate actually removed this provision, but then during the course of debate, we were able to get it put back in. So very, very happy to get that done. And another provision, Anastasia, that was added to that House Bill 315 was an issue dealing with housing discrimination. Earlier in the year, legislation was introduced, House Bill 438, that was designed to try to crack down on fair housing law violations. And the sponsors of this legislation initially said, home sellers can discriminate against buyers solely based on the buyer's name. And so initially they had proposed some ideas that would require realtors to redact the buyer's personal information on documents that were sent to the seller to try to hide the buyer's name and therefore crack down on housing discrimination. A number of groups had some concerns with that, and a number of our members had concerns with that. They did not feel comfortable redacting information on legal documents. And so we worked with the sponsors, and the end result was an amendment into House Bill 315 that would require the home seller to sign a standalone disclosure form that details all federal and state fair housing regulations, as well as the penalties associated with violating those laws. And the thought is that this is going to, one, educate the seller, but really force real estate professionals to have an honest conversation with their sellers about housing discrimination, what it means, and how to avoid violating those laws that are in place. So I think it'll be a positive change for Ohio, and one that we were happy to support in this bill. And Anastasia, before we move on, a couple things that we worked on in lame duck that didn't get passed. And so some may say, hey, you lost these issues. I kind of view it the other way. Legislation can take years and years to pass. And a couple issues that we worked on, first being real estate wholesaling. Many of our listeners probably are aware of this practice and the harms that it can do to homeowners, stripping them of equity and just taking advantage of some of our most vulnerable Ohioans. We, for the first time ever, introduced legislation to try to crack down on this practice and educate consumers and homeowners about the dangers of wholesaling. And that bill received 2 hearings over the last few months in the Senate. And, it didn't pass, but we raised awareness. We brought attention to this issue, and it really sets the foundation for our work next session. And hopefully we can get some quick passage on that legislation. And in that same vein, Anastasia, Senate Bill 299 is a bill trying to protect private property rights. We've seen so many local governments completely ban or regulate short-term rentals. And this really pulls the rug out of many Ohioans who have purchased a property with the intent of renting it out and engaging in short-term rentals. And local governments just come in and close the door on them. And that is a clear violation of private property rights. And so we introduced legislation restricting what local governments could do to prevent short-term rentals. That bill received 2 hearings in the Senate as well. And again, sets that foundation for our work next session. So even though those did not pass, we gained some momentum, and I'm very happy with our work on those as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for breaking these down. And like you said, having these discussions, this GA is important for setting the groundwork for next session. So each of these priorities touches on issues that have a real impact on property owners and realtors alike across Ohio. And something else that was important to us this year was occupational licensing. The legislature did its 6-year review of licenses issued through the Division of Real Estate and Professional Licensing. And they did this through House Bill 238. Which was a major priority for us. Can you tell our listeners about what all this review involved and the changes that we advocated for?
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up, Anastasia. This was a 2-year-long process. And as you said, every 6 years, the state reviews every occupational license in Ohio. And they've been doing this for a while now. And the intent is to ensure that Ohio doesn't have barriers to entering a profession that don't exist in other states. And so they really look at things like the hours of pre-licensing education, the amount of experience you may need, the education you need to receive prior to becoming a license. And it's not just in the real estate industry. They do this for doctors, cosmetologists, a whole slew of professions. So what this session, they reviewed the Division of Real Estate and the licenses issued by the Division of Real Estate. So when they started looking at real estate salespeople and brokers, they noticed a couple of things. One, Ohio requires 120 hours of pre-licensing education for salespeople. Every other state surrounding us, it's right around 90 hours of pre-licensing education. So we had more hours of pre-licensing education. We also require our brokers to have 2 years of post-secondary education, so 2 years of college education. We're the only state that we could find in the nation that actually requires that 2-year post-secondary education requirement. So that was unique to Ohio. And lastly, we require our real estate schools to offer college credits, which again, Ohio is unique in the entire nation. We're the only state that requires our real estate schools to provide college credits. Some call it accreditation, but what it does, it really restricts the type and number of schools that can operate pre-licensing education in Ohio. And so as the lawmakers looked at this, they were really looking at the hours of education, the 2-year post-secondary training for brokers, and then the requirements for our education providers. At the end of the day, lawmakers made a number of changes, Anastasia. They removed the post-secondary education requirement for brokers. Initially, this caused some concerns, but as we started diving into it, brokers would still need to obtain their pre-licensing education through an approved provider. They would also need to have the experience requirements that are currently set in place, and they still need to pass the broker exam. So as far as the quality of broker, I don't think this will negatively impact it. In fact, we were talking to a number of longtime salespeople, folks that have been in the business for 20 or 30 years. And they said, I just wasn't able to become a broker because I wasn't in a position to go back to college. And so this will hopefully help them transition into the role of a broker. Mm-hmm. For the real estate schools, they did get rid of the requirement that real estate schools must provide college credits. And the change with that one was met with a bit of pushback. However, we were able to make some changes. There were fears that this would allow these fly-by-night education providers to come to Ohio and start providing education, taking advantage of folks. We certainly didn't want that, so we made a number of changes. For the first time ever, we're going to require our online courses to be certified by the Association of Real Estate License Law Officials. Some of our listeners may know them as Orillo. They are kind of the poster child of certifying quality online education and reviewing the platforms that the education is provided through. So we were able to add that to the bill. And then we were also able to give the Division of Real Estate a bit more oversight over some of the new schools that may be coming to Ohio. So we felt comfortable with that change. And then the last change dealt with the hours of pre-licensing education. Like I said, for salespeople, like I said, Ohio does have more than any of our surrounding states. In some states, the hours of pre-licensing education is as low as 40. So in Michigan, it's they only need to receive 40 hours. We work quite a bit with lawmakers on this provision, and the final bill reduces our hours of pre-licensing education from 120 to 100. It would make a 10-hour cut in the appraisal education and 10 hours in finance. That's how they get to the 20-hour reduction. We were not happy with that. We pushed back, but at the end of the day, Ohio will still have a higher number of pre-licensing education hours than any of our surrounding states. So hopefully we can look at improving the quality of education, and that 20-hour reduction won't result in lesser trained and lesser qualified realtors working in Ohio.
Yeah, definitely.
This episode of The Real View is brought to you by the Ohio Association of Community Colleges. Ohio's network of community colleges provides accessible training that accommodates the busy lifestyles of aspiring real estate professionals at half the price of a traditional university. With convenient locations in every part of the state, as well as online options, Ohio's community colleges are your smart choice for pre-licensing education. For more details or to start the journey to a real estate career, visit the education page at ohiorealtors.org and then click on the pre-license course locations.
Was there anything that surprised you this lame duck session?
Yeah, one thing that has been discussed for really the entire legislative session, the last 2 years, is the issue of property taxes. Ohioans are seeing their property values rise significantly. And as those values rise, so do property taxes. And it really has become a problem. We are seeing and have heard stories of Ohioans being forced out of their homes because they can't pay their property taxes. And this is not just an issue in Southern Ohio or Northern Ohio. It's all over the state. And so we need to do something to address property taxes. On the other hand, we also need to ensure that our local governments, our schools, our firefighters, that they have the resources necessary to provide services to our citizens. So it is an extremely complicated issue. We've seen dozens of bills introduced trying to reform Ohio's property tax system or providing property owners with some sort of relief, but there was nothing agreed on. The legislature did create a joint committee on property tax review and reform. They were supposed to issue a report by the end of the year, and I'm not seeing that report. We're coming up to the end of the year, and it hasn't been unveiled yet. If they were going to do something with that report, they would have done it during lame duck session, and they did not. So that being said, lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, Democrat, Republican, they both agree that property taxes are an issue in Ohio. We need to do something. That solution is the problem. What is the solution? I don't think it's a single approach. You got to take a multifaceted approach to solving this problem, and it's something that we at Ohio Realtors is committed to solving. We're partnering with a lot of groups to come up with ideas, look at what other states do, and hopefully we can come to some sort of resolution here in the near future. But it just was not addressed at all in lame duck.
Yeah, but at least it sounds like lawmakers do have an appetite to get this fixed and come up with some sort of approach. So we will see what happens next General Assembly. But now let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Lame duck is just a small part of the work we've done throughout the broader General Assembly the past 2 years. Andrew, can you walk us through some of the overarching legislative initiatives that we have been able to get through this term?
Yeah, over the course of 2 years, it's amazing how many bills get introduced. It's sometimes that I often overlook, but over the course of 2 years, over 1,000 bills get introduced in the House and Senate, and it's really incumbent upon us to review every single bill to make sure there's nothing in there that can be harmful. And of those 1,000 or so bills, we were monitoring over 100 bills that could impact the real estate industry and our operations. And so much of what you hear of our wins really may not be end up in a bill signing, but it's defeating issues that may be difficult for us to implement or may increase taxes, but they never make the headlines. So a lot of our victories are wins that you never hear about. But a couple of things that we were able to actually get done and get passed. What really sticks out to me is House Bill 466. This is the bill that was introduced in response to the settlement agreement with NAR. We realized we needed a standard for the use of written representation agreements in Ohio, not just for realtors, but for the entire real estate industry, all licensees. And so we were able to introduce House Bill 466, I believe, in late March of this year, and it passed almost in record time in just a few months. And that was one that stood out because we engaged our state political coordinator program and had them reach out to their legislators. And this was an issue that it was really an all hands on deck grassroots movement. Hey, we need this done and we need it done quickly. And lawmakers responded and they were able to pass this legislation. So I took a lot of pride in that. And then also going back to 2023, we had an opportunity in the state operating budget to get quite a bit done. And a few of those programs that I would like to highlight, I mentioned the Ohio Homebuyer Plus program, the savings account for the purchase of a new home. This is something that we were advocating for 5 or 6 years, and it just never got through to the finish line. But we finally got it done. And not only did we get it done, it has become probably the most popular program of its kind in the nation, with almost 20,000 Ohioans opening up accounts. It just has been so well received. And knowing that we were a part of creating a program that's helping tens of thousands of Ohioans purchase a new home is just, I take a lot of pride in that as well. And then we also in the state operating budget saw historic investments at the state level in new housing construction. They created 3 new programs: the State Affordable Housing Tax Credit Program, the Welcome Home Ohio program, and the Single Family Housing Tax Credit Program. And these 3 programs alone, Anastasia, are providing over $200 million a year in new housing construction. And that's, like I said, an historic investment in new housing construction. We had a lot to do with the creation of those programs. We helped spearhead some of those programs, and hopefully we can build upon them moving into next year. We also made some positive tax changes for the business community and our members. The state operating budget exempts businesses with gross receipts under $6 million in 2025 from paying or even filing the commercial activities tax. And for those listeners that have dealt with the CAT before, they call the commercial activities tax the CAT. It can be onerous to you probably have to hire an accountant to go through that process and that filing process. And to exempt those businesses with gross receipts under $6 million, that's most small businesses in the state. And so we took a lot of pride in getting that done. We also made some changes to the threshold for the number of signatures that are required to repeal township zoning plans. We see townships go through the process of approving projects or developments, and then through the referendum process, a few number of upset citizens can collect signatures and get a repeal measure on the ballot. It was happening all over the state, but so we were able to increase that threshold. And then we were also able to modernize how county recorders maintain their documents and ensure that they're available online to make them more accessible. That was a bill that had been introduced for years and finally made it over the finish line this legislative session. And then we also made some changes to protect Ohio's homeowners. Many of our listeners are probably aware of, they called it a long-term right to list agreement or a 40-year right to list agreement, where companies were approaching homeowners and getting them to essentially sign up for an exclusive listing agreement that would last as long as 40 years. They took some aggressive tactics, and the Attorney General got involved, and we were able to crack down on that practice in the state operating budget. So we took a lot of pride in that as well. And so it was a busy session for us, Anastasia. We kept our legislative steering committee very busy, but we were able to get a number of victories.
That's wonderful. And as we celebrate these ones, it's important to remember that our work is never done. With the 136th General Assembly just around the corner, the needs of property owners, realtors, and our communities are evolving. Andrew, looking ahead, what are some of our key priorities Ohio Realtors will focus on to keep driving this positive change for our members, for homeowners, and the real estate industry?
Yeah, it's interesting, Anastasia. I said some of the victories that we have don't end up in headlines or may not even result in legislation being passed, but we have done a great job of laying the foundation this year for issues that we will be pushing next year. And I think at the top of our list next year has to be property taxes. We need to show Ohioans that the state is doing something to provide relief, especially for those who are on fixed incomes and just can't afford spikes in their property taxes. So I'm confident that we will see some reform. Like I said, this is not a partisan issue. Republicans and Democrats agree that we need to do something, and we also need to protect our local governments. So I'm confident that we will find a solution to that problem. And kind of in that same vein is the housing shortage. One of the reasons why property values and property taxes have increased so much is because we have a housing shortage. If we can increase the number of homes in Ohio, we should be able to lower the cost of housing, and therefore property taxes will go down. And there's a number of approaches to addressing the housing shortage. We have been working on developing a pattern book that local governments could adopt, and it would expedite the permitting process for any new projects that meet the specifications in this pattern book that's adopted. We're looking at local zoning reforms and incentivizing local governments to adopt pro-housing policies. And then we're going to fight to continue to and make those investments in new housing construction like we did in the state operating budget. So that will be a fight that we continue to have, and a discussion that we continue to have with lawmakers going into next year's state operating budget. We also look forward to continuing our work on short-term rental regulations and trying to protect private property rights from local governments really cracking down and intruding on those rights by banning short-term rentals. I expect that early on next year, we will have legislation introduced, hopefully in both the House and the Senate, to try to limit what local governments can and can control when it comes to short-term rentals. And then wholesaling, that's something that I really want to see some movement on. We need to do more to protect Ohioans from predatory practices in the real estate industry, and wholesaling certainly is one of those practices. So we need to make sure Ohio's homeowners are protected and informed before they enter into contracts dealing with the transfer of their properties. So those are the four main issues. I say that, Anastasia, and you know this better than anybody. We go into a session thinking we're going to tackle four issues, and before we know it, we're testifying on 24 bills, and it just things will get busy next year. We have a state operating budget early on. It'll be introduced in February, and this is a massive multi-thousand-page bill that appropriates billions of dollars in state spending. And anytime you have a bill that large, you can expect thousands of policy changes. So hopefully we'll be able to make some improvements. And then I also want to highlight our Realtors at the Rotunda event taking place on March 26th of next year. This is a great opportunity for our listeners who have not attended in the past. We hosted at the Ohio State House. It's an all-day event. You get to meet with lawmakers, and then you get to see some of the issues really firsthand that we're addressing at the State House. We bring in experts to participate on panels and lawmakers to discuss what they're working on. And it really, if anyone is interested in getting a crash course in the legislative process, I can't stress Realtors at the Rotunda enough. It's just a great event all around.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will have more information on that on our website. But Andrew, thank you for walking us through all the legislative work we've engaged on. It's going to be a really busy General Assembly for the next 2 years. And we are very excited to work on all the issues that you mentioned.
Oh, sorry to interrupt, but thank you for having me. It's great to kind of do this at the end of the legislative session. It gives you the opportunity to go back and look at everything that we worked on. I know in prepping for this podcast, it really just kind of amazes me every single time of all the issues that Ohio Realtors engage in. It's we are certainly not a single subject lobbying group. We dive into so many different issues, and it's a lot of fun. It keeps us busy, and knowing that we're fighting for issues that improve Ohio. I keep on saying I take a lot of pride in what we do because we really are working to make Ohio better, and it makes this work worthwhile for sure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Andrew. And to our listeners, if you want to learn more about our legislative priorities, be sure to check out our advocacy page on ohiorealtors.org. Thank you for tuning into this episode, and we will see you in the next episode of The Real View.
Thank you for listening to The Real View. That wraps up today's episode. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at ohiorealtors.org/The Real View and on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Have questions, comments, or suggestions? We want to hear from you. Email us at podcast@ohiorealtors.org. We'll see you next time.